the town's oldest unmarried woman at 52. A trapper called her his whole life. There's a beaver pelt I keep nailed above the door. 40 years on the line, and that one's still the best I ever took. Prime winter fur, thick and dark all the way down to the underfur. August Meyer offered me $6 for it back in '79, and I told him he could keep his $6. He thought I was a fool. I was probably right to let him think it. He was a buyer. Buyers always think you're a fool for holding onto the thing that's worth holding. I look at that pelt now and I think about the morning I stretched it. January, the Cimarron country before I moved north. I'd been out 3 days and my feet were wrong, not froze, but close. That deep ache that means you've pushed it past what's smart. And I came into camp before first light and built the fire too big because I was too cold to care about the wood. I remember the smell of the coffee and the cold still coming off the hide and thinking, this is the whole of it. This is what my life is. A good pelt and a fire and nobody on this earth to tell about either one. I was 34 years old. I didn't know then that I'd be right about that for another 18 years. And I didn't know the part that was coming after. My name is Calhoun Prentice. Most people called me Cal, though I never asked them to. My father was a trapper on the upper Missouri when the beaver trade was already bleeding out, and he didn't have the sense or the stubbornness to quit. He died of a fever in the winter of '61, which was the same winter I turned 16, and I inherited his traps and his debt, and a mule named Esther who I had to sell before the ground thawed because I couldn't feed her. I didn't grieve him much. He wasn't the kind of man who invited it. He'd been hard on me in the way frontier men are hard on their sons, not cruel, just absent from anything that wasn't the work. And by the time he died, I'd already spent 2 years being his hired hand more than his boy. There was a season of trying to be something different. I hired on at a feed store in Caldwell for 8 months. The owner, a man named Burkhart, was more patient with me than he should have been. I wasn't lazy, I worked, but I couldn't stay indoors. It was a physical thing, not a preference. After 4 hours inside, I'd start feeling the walls like a horse feels a too tight stall. I couldn't explain it to Burkhart without sounding like I was complaining about a job that was good work, and I liked the man too much to do that. So I left on a Tuesday with my wages and a set of his competitors' catalog prices folded in my shirt pocket, and I bought my way back into trapping before the week was out. That was the last time I tried to be something else. The thing about the line, and I don't know how you say this to a person who hasn't done it, is that it gets in you like a cold. Season to season you think, this is the last one. Spring'll come and I'll go down to the settlements and find something with walls and a wage. But spring comes and you go down and you walk around the towns for 2 weeks and everything feels too loud and too near, and you can smell yourself against the other men, and you start thinking about a particular stretch of creek you left sets on, and whether the ice is off it yet. And you go back. I went back every year for 40 years. The years on the line weren't lonely. That's important to say. A lot of men get eaten up out there, come back with a hollow look, thirsty for voices and company, not quite right until they've drunk enough whiskey at enough bars to fill whatever the emptiness is. I came back satisfied most years. Satisfied the way you are when a thing's done right, when the season's honest and the work held. The loneliness, when it came for me, came in the towns, watching other men walk to supper with a woman, watching children follow a man they knew was theirs. It was a low feeling, not the sharp kind. More like a coat that's a little short in the sleeves. You notice it mostly when you're standing still. I came to Harlan Creek the first time in the spring of '81. I was 36. It wasn't much then. Dix's trading post, a smithy, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, a handful of homesteads strung out along the creek. I came in off a rough winter on the Powder and sold my take to Dix, who was honest enough for a buyer and meant to push on within a week. I saw her on the second day. She was at the post, buying flour and telling Dix he'd shorted her the last time, and she wasn't wrong about it. Dix had a thumb on the scale and the whole town had made a quiet peace with it except her. She said it the way you'd tell a man he'd left his knife on the table. Plain, No heat in it, just the fact. Dix looked at the floor. She waited. He added to the measure without a word. She wasn't beautiful in the way that announces itself and demands your attention. She was a straight-backed woman with good hands, dark hair already threading gray at the sides, and she moved with an economy to her. No extra motion, nothing wasted. She picked up her flower, said, "Thank you, Mr. Dix," in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but exact, and walked out into the spring light. I asked Dix who she was. He said her name was Nora Gill. She ran the school out of the church. She'd been in Harlan Creek since '77 and was the best-read person in the county, which everyone agreed on. I asked if she was spoken for. He said no, that several men had tried over the years and that she had a way of discouraging it that left a man feeling he'd misread something rather than been refused. I asked him what he meant by that. He shook his head and said I'd understand when I saw it. I didn't try to court her. I want to be honest about that from the beginning. I wasn't in the habit of pressing, and even if I had been, I could read well enough to know that pressing was exactly the wrong approach with this particular woman. I walked past the church a time or two more than was necessary. Once I helped her carry a crate of books from Dix's back porch to the schoolroom because she asked, and I was standing there. I didn't try to extend those minutes into anything they weren't. Part of it was plain shyness, which I'd carried since I was a boy. Part of it was that she already felt like something that mattered, and I didn't want to be the next man on the list of those she'd looked at and not seen. I bought my supplies, settled with Dix, and left for the northern country at the end of May. The following spring I came back through. She was still there, the school was still running, and they'd added a rough-cut room onto the church with lumber that wasn't quite plumb but was standing. I could hear her voice through the open window as I rode past patient level, going through something about distances or measurements. I didn't stop. That was the year I made Harlan Creek my regular stop on the way in and out of the northern country. I told myself it was the trading post. Dix's prices were fair, and the trail in from the north was easier than the Caldwell route. Both things were true. Neither was the whole story. Over the next few years, I built up what I would call an acquaintance with her. Not friendship. She had friendships, real ones. Women from the homesteads who came to her with problems and went away lighter, men from the congregation who valued her counsel. What I had with her was something more like a standing recognition. She knew my face, knew what I did, knew I came through in May and October. Once, maybe the third or fourth year, she asked me about the Cimarron country because a student of hers had a relation down there, and she wanted to know if the map she was using was accurate. I told her more than she probably needed: the lay of the creek, the distances, where the ford was safe and where it wasn't, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, then asked 2 questions that showed she'd followed every word. I walked away from that conversation feeling like something I don't have a good word for, like I'd been taken seriously. Not as a curiosity, not as a useful specimen of a dying type, but as a man with knowledge that was worth having. That feeling didn't come often. The truth is I was easier in the country than in any town. On the line I knew what I was doing, and the evidence of it was around me in every clean set, every well-stretched hide, every camp I struck and broke without incident. A man's competence is visible to himself out there. In town, it's invisible. In town, what's visible is your clothes and your horse, and whether you have a wife and a house with a proper floor. By those measures, I was thin every year. I came into Harlan Creek in spring with a good season behind me and a winter's worth of grime on me, and I'd sell my take and buy my supplies, and the town would look at me as a type, not a person. That was fine. I wasn't looking to the town, but it accumulated the way cold accumulates. You don't feel it as cold so much as you feel a general slowing. She was different from the start, and I knew it from the start. I just didn't know what to do with the knowing, so I didn't do anything for a long time. The years passed in the way they do when you're alone and working fast from the outside, full enough from the inside. I had good seasons and poor ones. I had a winter on the Powder River when the sets came up empty for 3 weeks running, and I lay in my bedroll at night thinking about what I'd do if I couldn't make the season pay. I had a spring when the water was high, and I lost a full week of sets to flooding and came out of the country with less than half what I'd counted on. Those weren't breaking years. You learn to absorb them the way you learn to absorb cold. You take it in, and you keep moving. But I was getting older. That's the thing that doesn't announce itself when you're young and working hard. You just notice one morning that your knees are slower to warm up than they were. You notice that you're making decisions on the line you wouldn't have made at 30, pulling back from a crossing that a younger man would have taken on, making camp an hour earlier, eating better because your body has started insisting on it. The work was still the work, but it cost more. I came through Harlan Creek every spring and every fall, and the town grew each year. By the time I was 45, it had a proper main street, a hotel, a barber, a photographer who'd come up from Wichita with his equipment and done good business, because people with new lives want evidence of them. The railroad had come up from the south and changed the supply lines and the economy and the kind of men who passed through. Dick's had competition from a general store that carried more goods. The homesteads had multiplied into something that was starting to look like settled country rather than frontier. In settled country, a man like me is a different thing than he is in the frontier years. Out front of the process, I was useful. I knew the country. I could read it. I could survive in it when men with more capital and more ambition couldn't. Once the process has passed you by, that same set of skills makes you a holdout, a relic, something that the new arrivals look at with a kind of puzzled tolerance. I could feel it shifting the way you feel a change in weather. Not a door slamming, just a draft under it. Nora Gill was still there through all of it. Still running the school, still living in the house behind the church the congregation had built for her. She was 44 the fall I was 47, and that was the fall I had the worst season I'd had in 10 years. The beaver were almost gone from my stretch of the powder, and what I brought in barely covered my supplies. I sat in Dix's post and Dix poured me a whiskey without being asked, which was how I knew it was visible on me. She came in while I was sitting there. She stopped at the door when she saw me and said, "Mr. Prentice, I heard your season was a hard one." I said it had been a lean year. She said, "You'll come back stronger. You know that country better than anyone living." I thanked her. She nodded and went to the counter and did her business and left. I sat with my whiskey and thought about what she'd said. I know how that sounds like a small thing, the kind of polite encouragement people throw out without meaning much by it. It didn't feel like that. What she'd said was a true thing about a real skill, said plainly, with no softness in it to make it comfortable for either of us. Not don't lose heart or things will improve. The specific fact, you know that country better than anyone living, like it was worth something. Like I was worth something, and the basis for it was real. I thought about that sentence on the ride north. I was 47 years old and I could count on one hand the times anyone had said a thing like that to me. My father's trapping partner, Sims, watching me read a set of tracts when I was 15. That boy has an eye. And then a long silence where the same kind of thing just wasn't said. You get used to that silence. After a while, you stop noticing you're used to it. And then someone says a true thing in plain language, and you notice the silence all at once, like you've been living in a room with a low ceiling, and someone just raised it a foot. The winter on the powder that year, I thought about it more than I should have. I'd be working a set in the cold, and that sentence would surface the way things do when you're alone and quiet. You know that country better than anyone living, and I'd hold it for a minute and set it back down and keep working. It wasn't pining. It was more like inventory, checking whether something was real or whether I'd made more of it than was there. I went through that check several times over the course of that winter, and I always came out the same place. She'd looked at me like I was real and said something true, and that was rare enough to remember. I'd been looked at different ways over the years. I want to be clear about that so you understand the difference. Men at trading posts looked at me as a fellow working man, which was decent and plain and asked nothing of either of us. Women in the towns looked at me mostly as a type, the trapper, which was one step above drifter in their estimation, which was fair enough, because what were the odds that a man who'd spent his whole life moving through country was going to stay in one place and be a reliable husband and neighbor? Not good odds. I didn't blame them for seeing it clearly. The preachers and the better-off men in the settled towns looked at me as evidence of a dying era, which they weren't wrong about, and some of them were kind about it, and some of them weren't. I'd had a minister in Caldwell say to me once, not unkindly, that it was a hard life I'd chosen, and he hoped I'd find my way to something more settled before it was too late. He meant well. The pity in it was honest pity, not malicious. What Nora Gill had done that day in Dix's post was different from all of that. She hadn't seen the type. She'd said a specific true thing about a specific actual skill, and by doing that she'd said, "I see you, not the trapper in general. You, this particular man who has spent a particular number of years in a particular stretch of country and knows it in a way nobody else does." That's what landed. The spring of '88 I was passing through Harlan Creek when there was a situation at the school. A Homestead man named Corley, big and working himself up over something one of his boys had been taught about land titles, came into the schoolroom loud. He wasn't going to strike her. I don't think that was in him. But I don't know, but he was a physical man and he was close, and his voice had that edge in it that makes you pay attention. I walked in because the door was open and I was passing, and something in the sound of it pulled me. I didn't do anything threatening. I walked in and stood to the side and said "afternoon" to the room in a conversational tone. Corley looked at me. I'm not a small man, and 40 years of outdoor work doesn't leave you looking soft. He finished saying his piece to her, quieter this time, and left. She thanked me. I said it was nothing. She said it wasn't nothing, but thank you for making it quiet. That was the first time I let myself think she might actually see me, not the trapper who passed through twice a year. Me. 2 years later, in the summer of '90, they hired a second teacher for the school and her load lightened some. She seemed to know what to do with extra time in a way some people don't. She was reading more, corresponding with someone in St. Louis about curricula, and she'd started growing things in the patch behind the house with a seriousness that suggested she intended to get it right. I noticed these things because by then I was staying 3 weeks in Harlan Creek instead of 1, which I told myself was because the late spring cold was keeping me from moving north, which was partly true and mostly not. One evening that June she asked if I'd eaten and I said not yet, and she fed me at the small table in her house. A stew with turnips and dried beef, the honest kind of food that fills you and doesn't pretend otherwise. We talked while we ate, not at each other, with each other. She'd been reading something about beaver behavior and habitat, and she wanted to know if the field observations matched what I'd seen over the years. They mostly did, with some errors. I told her which were which, and she made a small note in the margin of the book. We talked past dark. I walked back to Dix's with my hands in my pockets and told myself, "You are 50 years old and a trapper, and you have no business building something in your head out of a supper and a conversation." I didn't. I kept the lid on it. I'd gotten good at keeping the lid on things over the years. It's a skill the line teaches you, or the line selects for, I'm not sure which. You learn not to want loudly, because loud wanting in the country alone is just a kind of suffering with no exit. So I kept the lid on and I went north for the fall season and I did good work, and I came back through in October, and we talked for maybe 20 minutes at the post, and that was that. But I heard the town's verdict on her around that time in a way I hadn't before, or maybe I started listening for it. The hotel owner's wife said it was a shame about Nora Gill, that a woman that capable deserved a family. One of the older Homestead men said she'd been too particular when she was young, and now she'd have to live with it. Dick said once, drunk, not meaning for me to hear it, that Nora Gill was the smartest person in the county and would die alone because she couldn't tolerate a man who wasn't her equal, and there weren't many of those. I didn't know if Dick's meant that as praise or complaint. Maybe he didn't know either. What I knew was this: she wasn't too particular. She just hadn't yet met a man who looked at her like a person rather than a problem to solve. There was a difference. I'd watched it for years, men approaching her with a kind of project energy, the way you approach a difficult negotiation, calculating what ground you'd have to give up to get what you wanted. She could see it from a distance. I could see her seeing it. And I understood why she walked away from all of them, because the ones who saw her clearly as a person and still wanted to be near her, that was a shorter list, and I wasn't on it. I was on the twice-a-year list, the acquaintance list. I hadn't put myself anywhere else. I thought about why, that winter. On the powder working the line, I thought about it carefully, the way I thought about decisions that mattered. I've been keeping my distance for 11 years, and there were real reasons, and there were also excuses dressed up as reasons, and it was time to sort the one from the other. The real reason was this: she was particular in a way that made me want to be worth choosing, and I wasn't sure I was. I was a 50-year-old trapper with a rented room and a pelt on the wall and no fixed address and no savings to speak of. The men who'd tried for her before, some of them had more than that. They'd had houses, businesses, standing in the community. They'd still not been enough, which told me the ledger she was using wasn't a financial one. But it didn't tell me what the ledger was or whether I was on it. The excuse dressed up as a reason was simpler. I was afraid of being the next man on the list of those she'd looked at and not seen. It was easier to stay where I was, which was at least a decent acquaintance, than to step forward and find out I wasn't what she wanted. That was a coward's calculation, and I knew it. I'm saying it plainly because I want to be honest about what I was and what it cost me to change. The fall of '92, I came through with a good season behind me, and a decision that I hadn't quite made yet working its way up to the surface. I'd been thinking about it since spring, and I wasn't going to tell you I'd been agonizing over it, because that's not quite the right word. More like I kept holding it up and looking at it from different angles, the way you look at a set of tracks to decide what's behind them. Not anxious, just careful, methodical, the way you are about anything that matters. I told Dix I'd like to work the southern stretches this winter and sell my take direct to him. He liked that arrangement. I rented the room above Hewitt's smithy, which was warm from the forge heat below and had a hook on the wall where I could put the pelt. I put my things in the room and looked at it, the pack, the traps, the rifle, the pelt against the wall, and thought, you have lived your life moving and you have just stopped moving. At 52. In a town where you're an acquaintance at best. You'd better be honest with yourself about why. I was. November came in cold and early. I worked the line on the southern stretches and came back to town every week or 10 days, sold my take, ate at the hotel, kept regular hours the way you don't on the far line. I ran into Nora 2 or 3 times a week, at the post, at the church, once at Hewitt's where she'd brought him something in a covered pot from some arrangement they had that I didn't know about. We talked the way we'd always talked. About practical things, about the country, about something she'd been reading. She didn't ask why I'd stayed and I didn't explain it. She invited me to supper the first week of November. Then the third week of November. Then twice in December. At the second supper in November, after we'd eaten and cleared the table, she asked me directly, "Why did you stay this season?" I had an answer prepared. The southern line, Dix's arrangement, the late fall route to Caldwell being rough. All true. She waited. She had a way of waiting that wasn't impatient or cold. It was just an open space, and you could fill it with the prepared answer or the real one. I'd never seen anyone do that quite the same way. It was more effective than pressure. I said, I suppose I was tired of spending every winter alone on the Powder River line. She was quiet a moment. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, I've been alone in this town for 22 years. It's a different kind of alone than a trapline. But the parts that matter to it are the same. I didn't answer that. I didn't know how. She got up and cleared the rest of the plates and brought coffee and didn't say anything more about it. But I carried it with me. I carried it the way you carry a weight you've been told to pick up and haven't decided where to put down yet. December was brutal. The coldest December in memory, the old-timers said, though old-timers always say that. The creek froze hard by the 15th. I worked the line in weather that would have turned me back a few years earlier, and I didn't let it turn me back now, partly because I needed the season to pay and partly because I had a reason not to come back to town with nothing. I worked harder than I had to. My knees told me about it at night. I paid attention to the knees and went out again in the morning. 2 days before Christmas, the smithy roof started going. Hewitt had patched it in October, but the ice load on it was more than the patch could bear. And on a Thursday morning, I saw a section separating from the frame and got up there with borrowed tools and 3 hours of careful work in 15-degree weather, my hands going numb enough that I had to stop twice and warm them on the chimney pipe. I got it stopped. Hewitt came out and looked at it and said I'd done good work and tried to take $1 off my rent, and I told him to keep it. I didn't tell anyone about the roof. Christmas Eve, she had people from the congregation to her house for supper. I wasn't among them, which was right and expected. I wasn't her congregation. I wasn't her circle. I was a man she'd known for 11 years at arm's length. I ate at the hotel and walked back to the smithy in the cold and read until late. I looked at the pelt on the wall and thought about the Cimarron Valley with the cottonwoods, where I'd sat an hour one April morning just looking at it before I worked the set. And I thought, you've been keeping that in your head for 18 years and you've never told a living soul about it. The day after Christmas, she came into the post. When she was leaving, she stopped at the door and turned back and said, I heard about Hewitt's roof. I said it was nothing. She said, people say that when they want you to understand it was something. I looked up from what I was pretending to look at. She said, you've been here since October. You've been useful and steady and you haven't made a fool of yourself or pressed in a direction you weren't asked. A pause. I've been waiting to see if you would. I didn't know where to put my eyes. She said, I am 52 years old. I am aware of what people say about that and I have been aware of it for several years and I have stopped caring about most of it. I would like you to come to supper on New Year's Eve, not as a courtesy or a custom, as something else. If that isn't what you want, say so and we'll go back to the way it's been, and there won't be any difficulty between us. I said, that's what I want. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something was confirmed, not surprised, just acknowledged, and she walked out into the cold street. I stood in Dix's post for a while. Dix was watching me from behind the counter with an expression I didn't look at directly. I said, not a word. He put his hands up. I walked back to the smithy and sat on the edge of my cot and looked at the pelt on the wall. Prime winter fur. Best I ever took. 40 years I'd kept it and I hadn't quite known why until that moment. I went to supper on New Year's Eve. She'd cooked a real meal, venison that had been in something all day, bread that was actual bread, and what she called a pie but was more honest about itself than most pies. She'd put a cloth on the table, white, not new but ironed smooth, and 2 candles. I'd cleaned up as well as I could manage in a rented room above a smithy, which had its limits. I wore the shirt I'd bought in Caldwell 3 years prior and barely worn. I brought a bottle of wine that I'd traded Dix for, probably not good wine. He said it was Californian and I had no way to disagree. And she accepted it the way she accepted everything, without comment, and put it on the table. We ate and we talked, and the evening went slow and easy, the way good evenings go when neither person is performing for the other. She told me about coming west. She'd been 29 in 77, teaching school in Ohio before that, and she'd answered an advertisement that most women of her acquaintance thought was either desperate or insane, because the advertisement was honest about what the territory was and what the school would be. Rough, isolated, under-resourced, no guarantees. She said she'd read the advertisement twice and felt something she recognized as interest rather than dread, which she decided to trust. She told me about the year before there was a proper building. teaching in a soddy with 2 windows and a dirt floor and 15 children. Some of them in coats. They didn't take off all winter because the stove wasn't enough. About the winter, one of the boys had walked 4 miles through a blizzard to tell her his sister couldn't come that week, and she'd asked him why he'd walked 4 miles just to tell her, and he'd said he didn't want her to worry. She told that story and smiled at the table, and I could see it still lived in her, clear and particular, after 15 years. I told her about the Cimarron Valley. The spring I'd followed a beaver pond back into a reach of country that nobody had mapped, cottonwoods just coming out, light at that particular angle you get in the early morning at that elevation, and no sound in the world but the water over the stones and the wind above it. I'd been working hard for 10 days and I was tired, and I sat down at the edge of it and just looked at it for maybe an hour before I worked the set. I'd never said that out loud to anyone. I hadn't thought about it in terms of telling. It was just something I'd put away and kept. She was quiet after I said it. Then she said, "That's what you do out there, isn't it? You find things nobody knows about." I said I supposed so. She said, "I've been in this town 22 years. I've been patient with people who thought I was unfortunate. I want you to understand that I'm not. I've had a life that was mine, and I chose it as best I could within what was available to me, and I don't regret most of it. But I want to be clear with you about tonight. I am not settling. I am 52 years old, and I looked at you for 19 years before I said what I said in Dix's yesterday, and I know what I'm doing." I said, "What am I then, since you've been looking?" She said, "An honest man, a skilled one who knows how to be still when still is called for and how to work when work is called for." A pause. "Those aren't common. Separately, they're not unusual. Together in the same person at your age and mine, they're not common." Then she said, "Also, you fixed Hewitt's roof in 15-degree weather and told nobody about it." I said, "Hewitt told you." She said, "Hewitt thought I should know. I think he was right." She got up to clear the plates. I stood to help, and she put her hand on my arm, the flat of her palm, through the shirt sleeve, a plain, unhurried touch, and said, "Sit down, Cal." First time she'd used my name. I sat down. She brought back the pie, and we kept going on the wine, which turned out to be drinkable, and we stayed at that table past midnight. The candles burned down to nothing, and she lit 2 more, and we talked through those 2, about the county, about a book she was partway through, about where I thought the beaver populations would be in 10 years if the pressure kept on. When it was time to go, she walked me to the door, and I put my hat on and stood in the doorway, and I looked at her in the lamplight from inside, her hair down now, the kitchen behind her warm and lit. I said, "Nora, I'm 52 years old. I've got a rented room above a smithy and a trapline and maybe 12 years of good seasons left in me if the knees cooperate. That's the whole account of what I've got." She said, "I know exactly what you have, Cal. I'm not interested in what you might have been or what you might have done differently. I'm interested in what you are." She said good night, and I walked back across the cold street to the smithy, and I stood in the dark room with the forge cold below and the pelt on the wall, and I didn't light the lamp for a while. I just stood there. I can't tell you exactly what I was thinking. It wasn't one thing. It was more like the feeling after a good shot, when you've taken aim at something that mattered and you've done it right, and the result is in front of you, and for a few seconds you're just standing in it before you start thinking about what comes next. I'd walked into this winter with a decision that wasn't quite made yet, and now the decision had been made for me, or with me, or around me, and I was 52 years old and standing in a dark room, and the only thing I was sure of was that I wasn't going north in the spring to spend another winter alone on the Powder River line. January went cold and clear. I worked the southern stretches and came back to town every 5 days or so, and on the evenings when I wasn't too stiff from the cold, we'd have supper at the house and talk. The evenings were easy in a way I'd never had with another person. She didn't need me to fill the silence. She didn't perform at me. She just was there, reading or working, and I was there and it was enough. I'd spent my life thinking that the comfortable quiet I had on the line was as good as it got, that it was the best version of human peace available to a man like me. It wasn't. The line was quiet because there was nobody there. Her house was quiet because neither of us needed the noise. Different things entirely. February, she asked me what I wanted to do about a more permanent arrangement. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, and I appreciated that she put it that way instead of as a question about feelings, which would have been harder to answer clearly. I said I'd like to stay if that suited her. She said it suited her fine. We talked about the practical shape of it. I'd be working the Southern line, she had the school income and the house, and by the time we'd finished the coffee it was settled. I asked her to marry me properly the next week. In Dix's post, which was where we'd spent most of our 11 years of acquaintance and which seemed appropriate. She said yes in a tone that was not romantic and not cool, just considered, like she'd already thought about the question, and I was catching up to an answer she'd already reached. That's what it feels like to be seen. Not pitied and not tolerated and not admired from a distance, the way people admire something old and unusual. Seen. She'd watched me for 19 years and she'd seen the parts that mattered, and she'd decided, plainly, without drama, without making a performance of it, that those parts were worth wanting. That's a thing a man can go a long time without. Most men go their whole lives. Some of them find it when they're old enough that it takes them a while to recognize what's happened. I think I was one of those men. We were married in March. I know it seems fast, but we were 52, both of us, and we'd known each other 19 years, and neither of us had any interest in a long engagement for the sake of propriety. The preacher said the words. Hewitt and his wife were witnesses. Dix cried a little and looked out the window while he did it. By noon it was done, and we walked back to the house behind the church together, which was now the house we both lived in. And she made coffee and we sat at the same table, and it was so ordinary and so right that I had to look out the window for a minute. The town had its views. The hotel owner's wife thought it was sudden. One of the homestead women said something I heard secondhand that wasn't kind. A man who was passing through, someone's Eastern cousin, said to Dix within my hearing that he didn't know the old trapper had it in him. I let that sit for a beat. Then I said I didn't either. Just to the air, not hostile. The man looked at me and couldn't find a place to put that and went back to his drink. I went back to mine. She kept the school for 2 more years after we married, then handed it to the young woman they'd brought up from Wichita and stepped back. It wasn't the hardest thing she'd ever done, but I could see it cost her something. She'd built that school from a soddy with a dirt floor into a place that turned out students who could read and reason, and letting go of it, even willingly, even to someone competent, was the kind of thing you feel in your chest for a while. She didn't stop working. She never stopped working. It wasn't in her nature. She took on the correspondence work for the county school board, which she did better than anyone had before her because she was meticulous and because she had opinions and wasn't afraid to commit them to paper. She started writing for one of the Wichita papers on an occasional basis, pieces about education and the frontier, about what the territory needed to become a proper state and what it would lose in the process. The editor there was a woman who recognized what Nora was and gave her space, which was the right call. I read those pieces. I was proud of them in a quiet way that I didn't express well enough at the time, which is something I'd do differently if I had it back. She kept the garden serious. She read in the evenings at the table while I cleaned gear or mended something, and she'd read things aloud that she thought I'd be interested in, which was more often right than not. Occasionally she'd ask me a question about something and I'd answer it, and she'd write down whatever part of it she found useful, which happened often enough that I started to understand she thought of me as a source, not just as a listener. That was its own kind of gratitude. I worked the line for 6 more years after we married. The last 3 I was pulling back, working closer to town, shorter runs, coming home every 4 or 5 days instead of being out for weeks. My knees were honest with me about it, and I listened because Nora was honest with me about it too, and together they were an argument I didn't want to win. She never pushed me to quit. What she did instead was ask good questions. How the knees were, whether the cold was harder on them than it used to be, whether I'd noticed anything on the line that concerned me, and she asked them the way she asked everything, in a way that was looking for the actual answer, not the one I thought she wanted to hear. I answered honestly because she'd earned it. And when I said one spring that I thought the next season might be my last, she said, "That sounds right," and poured me another cup of coffee, and that was that. The spring of '99, I sold most of my gear to a young man from Missouri who had the right kind of hunger in his eyes. I kept the good rifle, a pair of traps I'd had since my father's time, and the pelt. The young man from Missouri asked about the pelt, and I said it wasn't in the lot. He shrugged and took what he'd bought and rode out north, and I watched him go with a feeling I recognized as something between relief and grief, which is probably the right feeling for ending a life's work on purpose. We'd built a better place by then, not fine but solid, on a piece of ground on the east side of Harlan Creek that Hewitt had helped me buy in '94. We had a real floor, a cook stove that was more reliable than the fireplace, a root cellar that didn't flood, a south-facing window where Nora put her reading chair in the winter. I put the pelt above the door, same as always. She looked at it the first morning and said, "That's a fine pelt." I said it was the best I'd ever taken. She said, "Good, leave it there." The first summer we were married, '93, I took her south to see the Cimarron country. She'd never been in the high country at all, and I don't think she'd asked to go, but she came when I suggested it without making it into a larger thing than it was. The first 3 days were hard on her, the altitude and the cold and the way the camp is never quite comfortable no matter what you do to it. She didn't complain. She didn't ask to turn back. She got up when I got up, and she did what needed doing, and at night she was too tired to talk much, and she slept hard, which is the honest response to that country. On the 4th day, I took her into the valley. The cottonwoods were coming out. The same light I remembered, that particular spring morning angle on the water, the color of it when it's coming off moving water at that elevation on a clear morning. There's nothing else quite like it, and I've been carrying it in my head for 20 years without knowing if I'd gotten it right, or if I'd improved on it the way memory improves on things. I'd been afraid it would be smaller. Places you carry for 20 years tend to shrink when you get back to them. You've been living with the memory of your best day there, and the place itself is just a creek and some trees. It wasn't smaller. It was exactly what it was. The sound of the water and the wind moving in the tops of the cottonwoods and no other sound, and the light doing exactly what I remembered. She stood at the edge of it and looked out across it for a long time without saying anything. I stood beside her and didn't say anything either. Our horses were behind us, cropping what they could find. After a while she reached over and took my hand. She wasn't looking at me. She was still looking at the valley, and she held on. She said, "Now I know." I said, "Know what?" She said, "Why you kept coming back to this country, why you stayed." She wasn't talking about the valley, not only about the valley. I held her hand, and we stood there until the light moved. That night in camp, sitting by the fire, she said, "People in Harlan Creek think I was foolish, letting the years go by the way I did, not marrying sooner." I said I'd heard that. She said, "I didn't let anything go by. I was paying attention, that's different." I looked at the fire. She said, "When you know what you're looking for, you can wait for it. The ones who marry early because they're afraid of being without are the ones who end up with the wrong person. I wasn't afraid." I said, "You don't seem like someone who was ever afraid of much." She said, "I was afraid of one thing. I was afraid of being with a man who didn't see me. I watched women disappear into that. I watched them become the woman the man needed and lose the woman they were. I wasn't willing." I understood something then that I'd only half understood before. The men who'd tried for her over the years, the ones she discarded, gently, in the way that left them feeling they'd misread something. They hadn't been bad men. Most of them were probably good enough men. They'd just been looking at her from the wrong angle, looking at what they could build with her, not at what she actually was. I'd been looking at her from across Dix's trading post for 11 years before I even spoke to her plainly. And I'd kept looking for 19. Not because I was patient in some virtuous sense, just because I couldn't look away, and I didn't know what I'd do with the looking if I pushed it. Turned out she'd been looking back. I am 68 years old as I'm telling you this. We've been married 16 years. She is 65. She is still straight-backed, still exacting, still reads to me in the evenings because years ago she decided my eyes had taken enough strain from low light, and she wasn't going to let me add to it. We've gone through more books than I can count. I've argued with her about half of them, correctly about maybe a third of that half. She's better at argument than I am because she thinks in complete structures and I think in examples. And examples lose to structures in a formal exchange, but they tend to win in the long run, which is something we've both noticed and never quite resolved. She got hold of a book last winter about beaver behavior and habitat from a university press, and she left it open on my side of the table at a page she wanted to discuss. The book was right about some things and wrong about a few others, and we talked about it for 3 nights. And the third night she conceded one of my points with the grace that only comes from a person who cares more about getting it right than about being right, which is the rarest kind of grace. There's a thing about living with a woman who actually sees you, not the thing you fear, which is being known in a way that's just exposure, your failures more visible, your limitations confirmed. The thing you don't expect is that being seen by someone with a clear eye feels like having a better grip on yourself. I know who I am more certainly at 68 than I did at 50, because I've been living alongside someone who knows who I am too, and when your own idea of yourself and another person's clear-eyed idea of you are roughly the same thing, you stop second-guessing as much. You can put the energy into the work instead. I've done some of the best work of my life in the years since we married, not the trapping, which was winding down, but other kinds. I've been the man neighbors come to when something needs thinking through. I've been the man whose word carries in the county, in a quiet way, without me having to say much. She'd call that earned, not given, and she'd be right. The town is bigger now. Half the people in it don't know us. The ones who do know us mostly just know us as a fact. The way you know the creek is to the east. It's there. It's been there. It'll be there. A few of the older ones remember the version of me that was just the trapper who came through twice a year and smelled like the line and had nothing, and was probably going to stay that way. Some of them have been gracious about being wrong. Most have just moved on to other things, which is also fine. I don't need the town to know anything about it. What I've got is a good house and a woman who watched me for 19 years before she spoke, and when she spoke she said, "I know what you are, not what I'd been, not what I should have tried to be, what I am. I have the pelt above the door, prime winter fur. August Meyer offered me $6 for it in '79, and I told him to keep his $6. I kept it because I wanted one thing on the wall that I'd made with my own hands and refused to sell off. I thought that was the reason. Turns out I was wrong about that too, in the good way. The morning I stretched that hide I sat alone in camp on the Cimarron in January with the fire too big and the coffee ready, and I thought, this is the whole of it. A good pelt and a fire, and no one to tell. I was right about all of it except the last part. I just didn't know it yet.